The following is a Silver Bullion Television audiocast.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Today we have with us Caspar Rawles, who is an analyst with Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, a company specializing in independent price assessment and analysis in the lithium-ion battery raw material space of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite anode. Benchmark has advised some of the world's most influential corporations, including battery cell producers and electric vehicle manufacturers. And we're delighted to have him here today as our guest. Good day, Caspar, and welcome to SBTV. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak on your show today.
About Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, can you tell us more about what Benchmark Minerals Intelligence does?
Yeah, sure. So Benchmark was primarily set up to produce pricing for what we've kind of termed the critical minerals in the lithium-ion battery supply chain. So we are the lithium industry's reference price. We're working towards getting those prices written into contracts. We also do monthly pricing for graphite and cobalt as well. Alongside that, we offer consulting and forecasting services, so longer range forecast, supply, demand, prices, bespoke consultancy projects for the entire supply chain, and also companies who are looking to get into the space. And we also host a number of events each year as well.
Sounds very busy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
very busy.
Yeah. The electric vehicle trend, I believe the major trend that underpins what Benchmark does is the rise of electric vehicles. Can you give us an idea of the growth and the latest update on the electric vehicle trend at this moment?
Yeah, so, electric vehicles or even maybe 3 years ago, we were still getting questions, is it going to happen? Is that the future? But I think now, over the last 18 months to 2 years, I think it's unquestionable that electric vehicles are the future. So we're now kind of getting to the phase where we're starting to see semi-mass market and mass market electric vehicles come to the industry. So up until recently, I guess, outside of China, you only really had a limited amount of options. Obviously, Tesla would be one that comes to mind, but Nissan Leaf, Chevy Bolt. But now we're starting to see more models come to market. So certainly in European and North American markets, we're seeing adoption rates start to rise. And then, of course, in China, who typically are much further ahead in kind of their timeline for electric vehicle adoption, we saw well over 1 million vehicles produced in China, electric vehicles produced in China last year. So we're starting to enter this phase of more rapid growth.
Would you say the main driver of the electric vehicle trend are the governments who are pushing for zero emission targets?
Yeah, so there's kind of two main themes to that. I think certainly within China, so people look at it as a kind of a climate change topic, which it certainly is. But within China, I think it was as much clean air targets. So I don't know how much time you've spent in China, but obviously there's well-known and well-publicized issues around the quality of air in major cities, and not even just major cities, a lot of the cities there. And obviously that was having a very detrimental impact to the health. And China had to take serious steps to try and clean up the air in the city specifically. So that's why I think the government there has began to push EVs so heavily. Now, of course, elsewhere, that's not so much of a problem, but it's still relevant. But also with, as I said, climate change is a main driver. So trying to move transportation away from fossil fuels to effectively, the ultimate goal of using renewable energies on the grid. So moving away from coal and oil-fired power stations and electric vehicles with zero emissions. So, yeah, certainly clean air and climate change being the main drivers.
Yeah, with electric vehicles, it seems like one of the hurdles seems to be people feel that they can only go as far as the battery can take them from point A to point B, and that's it. Then they have to recharge again, and they aren't quite sure about the charging infrastructure. So I'll ask you this. How is the charging infrastructure keeping up with the increase of electric vehicle sales?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, obviously, I think people are probably relatively aware of the sort of supercharger network that Tesla has been developing for their vehicles specifically. So we're seeing growth in that, but Tesla are investing heavily in building out the infrastructure there. But also we're starting to see other auto manufacturers take it upon themselves to develop charging infrastructure. So so one of those programs is a kind of joint venture between VW, Ford, Daimler, I think BMW as well, to develop charging infrastructure within Europe. I think the target is 400 charging stations by 2020, which I think they've got quite a long way to go on that. Also, VW have announced some plans, so they've set up a couple of different companies to help develop charging infrastructure in the US and in Europe. They also made some announcements recently about using spent cells to develop mobile charging infrastructure that you could take to, say, large festivals or events that would be available for people to use there. But I think there are still some concerns. We're starting to see improvements in the charging infrastructure, but it's somewhere that probably still needs investment. I think it will certainly get there. I don't think, the timeline is impossible. I think maybe one of the only other concerns would be, obviously, we kind of expect that a lot of the charging will happen at home. So when you return from work, generally speaking, most people commute with their vehicles, so return from work, and there might need to be some upgrades to not to the grid, but between kind of the substations in suburban areas and the housing network. So some upgrades to allow for more heavy power infrastructures, because theoretically you might be in a situation where everyone comes home from work at 5 o'clock and plugs their car in. So there need to be some management there, but it's certainly something that isn't too far behind, but it still requires further investment. I mean, the technology to do this isn't that complex, but there'll need to be some kind of smart grid system which somehow tells your vehicle. I mean, it's manageable. You can already tell an electric vehicle when to charge. Most people want to charge at 2 a.m. when the power's cheapest. Right. But there'll need to be some kind of smart grid network that, once we see really high adoption rates, will manage that. So not everyone is turning on their charge or trying to charge their vehicle at the same time. And that not only brings around problems for the grid in the sense of overloading it, but also when we reach the really kind of extremes of what we can produce on the grid, that's when we find that peaker plants come on, which typically use coal or oil and therefore are the dirtier end of the energy production spectrum.
Can you give us an idea of how the cost of lithium-ion battery production has moved in the last 10 years, and what is the cost now, and where do you think it'll go in the near future?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even 10 years ago, the cost of production of a lithium-ion cell was well over $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Wow. We believe we're in an environment where and this is, I should add, this is not the cost to purchase the cell, this is the cost of production of the cell. We're now in an environment where we think one of the top manufacturers is producing cells for less than $100 per kilowatt hour. So a tenth of what it was 10 years ago. Not everyone's there. I think probably this year, the average cost for the majority of kind of larger automotive cell manufacturers will be something around $130 per kilowatt hour, maybe slightly more. But I think the goal is obviously to get that cost of the cell down to below $100 per kilowatt hour, and the ultimate goal is to get pack costs down to below $100 per kilowatt hour. These cost savings are largely being achieved by economies of scale. So we're starting now to see battery production facilities really start to produce in very significant volumes, and that's one way of achieving lower costs. But of course, we've got a lot of volatility in the raw materials that go into those cells, and that's something that needs to be addressed in order to ensure that we can keep below that $100 per kilowatt hour golden level.
Yeah, we'll get to that volatility in a bit. But with the growth of the electric vehicle trend, naturally there'll be a knock-on effect on the demand for lithium-ion battery raw materials such as cobalt and nickel. But despite this, the prices of both metals, they fell last year back in 2018. Why do you? I didn't expect that, but why do you think this happened despite the growth of the electric vehicle trend?
It's a good question. I mean, at Benchmark, I focus largely on cobalt, so I guess I can probably talk a bit more about cobalt in detail. But there's no simplistic answer to that. when we talk to the market, a lot of people assume that the reason the price fell was because of a lack of demand, and that's not the case. Yeah. There are a number of different factors that went into why the cobalt price fell. First thing I should add, these markets, so, cobalt, really we're talking about the cobalt chemical market. That's the chemical that goes into the battery, not the metallic form. Those markets are very small. There's a limited number of players. And I think they are not only dictated by supply and demand dynamics purely, as you would see in a larger commodity. There's a lot of factors, and I think sentiment can be a large driving factor in pricing, particularly within China. And China, I should add that China produces over 80% of the world's cobalt chemicals. So when we're looking at batteries, that is like the refining hub of the world by a long margin. So with cobalt, we saw, as I'm sure you're aware, during 2017, we saw a very rapid run up in prices. Yes. And that, towards the end of 2017, we saw certainly some more expensive payment terms for some of the feedstocks of cobalt. We saw some cash and credit issues in China attached to deleveraging, but also, of course, just the fact that the raw material was much more expensive than it was 6 or 12 months ago. So people were very stretched to purchase, which impacted buying patterns. Of course, macroeconomic factors such as the trade war, changes to the subsidy policy in China, all of these things had an influence on kind of really, I would say, the sentiment of the market as much as purchasing. And once that sentiment changed, prices started to fall, and they pretty much have fallen since the end of Q1 2018 to now, really. Which is perhaps contrary to what you would think with such interest around electric vehicles, but the no path to when we look at this story of multiple X growth, there's never a linear growth curve. There's always going to be ups and downs, and I think this is one of the downs at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were surprised by that. But do you think the current prices for battery metals such as lithium, nickel, and cobalt represent undervalue, fair, or overvalue at this moment?
Oh, that's a very tough question. I mean, define fair value. Certainly in the DRC, the cobalt producers will still be making money at this level, so you could argue that it's fair value or good for them. But this price now isn't going to incentivize new production, which is needed for the future. So I think in terms of looking at the EV picture as a whole, the prices of these raw materials are going to need to increase to help incentivize new higher cost production. That will come as the market tightens, as it inevitably will. We've seen, I think some of the factors that I talked about influencing cobalt are probably similar for lithium. There's certainly some of those factors influenced why we saw the lithium price come off, although perhaps not quite as drastically as we have with cobalt. I think with nickel, it's really too early. The nickel, so cobalt market, mined cobalt around 130,000 tons last year. The lithium market is around 300,000 tons. Nickel is 2.2 million tons. So the nickel market is far bigger. So it's probably a bit too early to say that EVs are influencing what's happening with the nickel price. But certainly as time goes on and, the volumes of nickel going into EVs increase for two reasons: more EVs being sold, but also the trend is in cathode technology is to move towards higher nickel and lower cobalt. That's when the volumes start getting quite frightening. And I think in the future, nickel is certainly one to watch as a potential, we could see some very strong price reaction as the market copes with that rise in demand.
The price of, let's say, a ton of cobalt or a ton of nickel on the LME price, is it possible to obtain physical cobalt nickel at that LME price?
Well, yeah. I mean, if you buy the LME contract, then you will take delivery. So yeah, I mean, obviously that is possible. The pricing that we've seen in the spot market away from the exchange has been somewhat different over the course of the last, sort of 12 to 18 months from the LME for a variety of reasons. And so, if you were to looking to buy outside of the exchange, you might see some slightly different prices. But I mean, yeah, you can purchase cobalt at that price, certainly. Yeah, cobalt metal.
Okay. Caspar, if you could pick only one, which of the following battery metals do you think is the most promising for investors? Lithium, nickel, or cobalt?
Oh, putting me on the spot. I mean, It's a good question. I think the reality is, depending on what kind of time horizon you're looking at, they're all going to be good investments because each of those minerals are critical to the EV revolution. And we've seen billions and billions of dollars committed by cell manufacturers, auto manufacturers to developing EVs, so we know it's coming. I guess it kind of depends on what time frame you're looking at now, and also how you want to invest. Cobalt is typically hard to invest in because the mines are cobalt is a byproduct, so they're typically copper or nickel mines. Lithium is perhaps slightly easier to invest in, and again, nickel tends to be larger mining companies with a basket of commodities in their portfolio. So they're all, but from my perspective, I see a bright future for all of them. I guess it depends exactly how you want to invest. I'm going to sit on the fence on the answer to that because that's not really our area of specialty. We just tell you the numbers, and you can make your own decision.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a very proper and diplomatic answer, so we'll happily accept that.
Okay.
I want to talk a little about a recent tweet by Benchmark Minerals Managing Director Simon Morse, where he shared about the 4 horsemen of the ICE, or internal combustion engine apocalypse.
Yeah.
Why is cobalt described as having a bad rep critical to trio, and which trio was he referring to, since graphite was also mentioned along with nickel and lithium?
I think he's probably, in terms of he's talking about the trio of maybe nickel, cobalt, manganese, or lithium, nickel, and cobalt, because they're kind of lithium is in the electrolyte, but also in the cathode as well. But I think cobalt has a brand image problem. I think perhaps that's what he was referring to, in the sense that there's been links between, obviously, cobalt artisanal mining in the DRC and human rights abuses, which also, including child labor, which is a problem that the industry is working to overcome at the moment. I think, obviously, we're starting to see the development of what's being termed kind of model mines in the DRC. So these are still artisanal mines. I mean, theoretically, there's nothing wrong with artisanal mining. It's just doing it by hand rather than with a machine. But it's doing it safely and legally, and ensuring, of course, that there's no children working at the site. So that's probably why it's got a bad brand image. The other side of it as well is, certainly from an auto manufacturer's perspective, it's very expensive and the price is highly volatile. And there's perhaps a perception that cobalt is controlled by a limited number of producers, obviously Glencore being the largest, but there's the majority of cobalt production is controlled by kind of a limited number of companies, and there's fears over so few people controlling what is really a very critical element to the function of a lithium-ion battery in terms of safety and life cycle.
In that same tweet, nickel was described as a leader but trying to eliminate cobalt. How real and feasible is this plan to eliminate cobalt from battery designs?
I think to eliminate it entirely from the cathodes we're using today would be extremely challenging. There's certainly a long-term trend to reduce the amount of cobalt we're using per cell or per kilowatt hour capacity, or however you want to look at it. So I think when the prices of cobalt were much higher, certainly in 2017 and perhaps in the beginning of 2018, there was a big push from cell and cathode manufacturers to move to more nickel-rich cathode types. And when we're talking about this, we're really referring to the nickel, cobalt, manganese cathode type. And we refer to it, as NCM. When that was originally produced or made commercially available, it was in even parts nickel, cobalt, and manganese, referred to as 111. We're now kind of commercially using a form called 523, so 5 parts nickel, 2 cobalt, 3 manganese. 622 is also available, although less common. And then ultimately the goal that people talk about regularly is to move to something called 811, so 8 parts nickel, very rich. Now, there were some quite big statements put out by a number of major cell manufacturers back in 2017 saying they would be introducing this 811 cathode type to commercial production for EVs in 2018. That obviously hasn't happened. It's not yet commercially available. And that's because there's a number of engineering challenges. So they relate to the life cycle, so the cell lasting as long as it needs to. If you're an auto manufacturer and offering a warranty on your pack, I think 8 years or 100,000 miles is kind of a standard. there is you obviously don't want that cell to fail before that happens, because replacing the pack is very, very costly, but also safety as well. So as you reduce the amount of cobalt, you bring around some thermal issues, which I'm not saying lithium-ion technology is dangerous, but you need to ensure that that isn't going to be a problem, and that requires further work on the pack, which adds cost, adds weight. So it's not very simple. So I think we will see that trend of nickel removing some of the cobalt, or replacing, should I say. But it's to remove cobalt entirely from the cathode would be very challenging for those issues that I kind of just referred to. But yeah, I think we will. Long-term trend is going to be higher nickel and lower cobalt.
Okay. Yeah, because my understanding of the how nickel and cobalt work together is cobalt actually helps to, or it does keep the nickel stable. So nickel, if you have nickel, you're going to need cobalt.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that from the research we do, we see over 80% of cathode technology going to EVs in kind of the medium to long term being that NCM cathode type. And I think a move away from that technology would be very challenging at the moment. I don't see anything. We think the next step after what we're using today would be solid state batteries, which are on at least a 10-year horizon. I mean, they're not yet perfected. They don't work effectively. I mean, they do work, but getting them to a commercial standard for EVs is going to be challenging. And there's also some supply chain issues around lithium metal and production that will, we still think it's a long-term horizon that would need to be overcome before you could make that technology commercially available and compete on a cost basis. So we think nickel, cobalt, or nickel and cobalt containing cathodes will be around for some time to come. And even with solid state, we think that they will probably still use the same cathode initially, at least.
Okay, yeah. With solid state, I've heard the best it can do right now is basically just barely make it across a parking lot with really not too much weight on it. So I would think solid state is very, very far away still. Yeah,
it's a very promising technology. There's just there's some engineering challenges that need to be overcome. I mean, as I say, we think it's the most promising, but the long-term horizon kind of thing. I think what we're using today, and the other thing is the lithium-ion we're using today, despite kind of reaching the theoretical limits of its performance, we're improving it. Via the pack, via the battery management software. So we're making those cars be able to go further or charge more quickly via various different techniques that are evolving as we improve our production and knowledge on EV packs, essentially.
Regarding nickel, do you think we'll see a bifurcation of the Class 1 and Class 2 nickel prices in the near future?
I don't know. There's obvious. So the theory is that you need to use Class 1 nickel for batteries, which in some ways is true, but it looks as though we may start to see from laterite H-power projects that actually there's an option to produce a mixed nickel cobalt precipitate for the battery industry, which would mean that you could theoretically use product from Class 2 or Class 2 mines or Class 2 production to go into the battery supply chain. So I'm not sure whether we'll necessarily see a bifurcation, as if that does prove itself to be true. I think that's one of the routes that the industry is looking to go down to get those incremental tons of nickel and cobalt for the battery supply chain. We may see some kind of different pricing structures in terms of premiums and discounts from maybe LME nickel for Class 2 and then battery grade nickel chemicals. It's sort of unclear at the moment, but there is promise for Class 2 product to enter the battery supply chain.
Simon Moore's Benchmark Minerals managing director was recently summoned by the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources to provide testimony on the supply chains of key battery raw materials used in energy storage. Now, the first thing that caught my interest was that he said, "We are in the midst of a battery arms race." Can you help us understand more about this global battery arms race and who are the competing players?
Yeah, definitely. So we saw this race, or this arms race, essentially start back in 2014, and that was when Tesla announced the Gigafactory. So Elon Musk had talked to Panasonic and tried to get them to significantly increase their production capacity, which he failed to do, so decided to take it in-house and produce lithium-ion. But essentially, at the time, I think the plan for the plant was as big as the entire supply of lithium-ion cells globally at the time. So with this announcement, I think a lot of the industry took note and saw the direction it was going in. And at the time, back in 2015, this benchmark had been tracking these what we term lithium-ion battery megafactories. There were three. There was the Tesla Gigafactory, as I say. LG Chem were planning a plant in Nanjing, which is now in production. And there was another one from a company called Foxconn that ultimately didn't happen. And they invested in a company called CATL, which is a Chinese cell manufacturer. Now, the players in the big five players in the race at the moment, I would say from China are CATL, the company I just mentioned, and BYD, Samsung, LG Chem, Panasonic. But we're seeing a huge amount of cell manufacturers come into that arms race. So we're actually tracking 72 battery plants globally, all with a capacity of greater than 1 gigawatt hour of cells, which is a significant number. Bearing in mind that prior to this arms race, all plants were on megawatt hour scale. Now they're on gigawatt hour scale. But yeah, they're kind of the top five, and we're seeing more and more announcements from other cell manufacturers all the time. SK Innovation have just announced that they're going to be building a second battery plant in Hungary, even though they haven't finished the first one yet. The race to kind of grow capacity and therefore, achieve economies of scale, but also hoover up market share at this early time in the industry is absolutely massive. And we're seeing, well over $100 billion of investment committed just to battery production capacity alone.
Okay, I noticed in those top five companies, not a single one was from the U.S., which is why perhaps in Simon Moore's testimony, another interesting thing that he said is the U.S. is a bystander in the global battery arms race. Why is the U.S. a bystander? Why do you think they're not trying to or pushing to take the lead?
Yeah, you have Tesla from the US, but their cell production in the US at the Gigafactory is actually done by Panasonic, so a Japanese company. Then Tesla take the cells on from there and put them into their vehicles. Why are they a bystander? I mean, it's kind of a good question. I think certainly there's been a huge drive from Asia, not just China, but Asia as well, particularly Japan and Korea, to develop their lithium-ion cell production and help the company. So there's been a government-backed drive to help that. Sorry, excuse me. But it's an interesting one. If you consider the size of the US car industry, and we know kind of where things are going, particularly with CO2 targets, it's something that they need to focus on. And the US government, I think, need to try and help those companies that wish domestically to set up lithium-ion cell production capacity, but also the entire supply chain. So they could, theoretically, the US could almost, I think, even produce the most, if not all, of the critical raw materials they would need for electric vehicle production, but it needs government drive, and I think that has been somewhat overlooked to this point.
Okay, and also in Simon Moore's testimony, he viewed the battery supply chain in three main elements: the mine, the chemical refiner, and the battery producing plants. How far behind is the U.S. in all three areas, and what are the risks or dangers that you foresee as its result?
Yeah, so in terms of, as I say, I spend most of my time on cobalt, so I will probably refer to that more than anything else, but the US doesn't have any producing cobalt mines at the moment. So in terms of mining they're limited. There is some lithium production in the US, but it's relatively limited. But there is some of that industry there. In terms of refining, there are no major cobalt chemical refineries domestically in the US. As I say, 80% of those chemicals are produced, or over 80% are produced in China. So they have they need to develop that capacity domestically if they want to ensure security of supply. And then in terms of cell manufacturing, as I said, very much Tesla dependent at the moment. That's by far the Tesla Gigafactory is the largest battery plant in the world at the moment. But as I say, that cell production is owned by Panasonic, or managed by Panasonic. Other plants in the US, one is owned by LG Chem. There is one by AESC. So these are all non-US companies that have cell production capacity. Now, the risk, of course, is being entirely dependent on raw materials and cells from other countries, particularly China. And of course, the other part of that is the US has a car industry. Largely speaking, I would say that the IP for an auto manufacturer sits really within the engine. A lot of companies can make a car a nice place to be, but developing a high quality and reliable engine is really your competitive advantage. Well, if you're talking about an EV, you don't have an engine, so you're buying in your IP from the likes of those large cell manufacturers I talked about. So that's a challenge for the automakers. You're giving away a lot of your margin as well. So if they can bring some of that capacity domestically, that will help in terms of dependency, but also, I think the auto manufacturers need to think about how they can try and maintain the same kind of profits or margins they have on ICE engines.
Okay. I think by now the listeners probably know the answer to this, but I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. Who's winning this global lithium-ion battery arms race?
Well, yeah, no surprise, it's China at the moment. As I say, in terms of battery production, China is going to house well over 60% of the world's production capacity for the next 10 years from our numbers. They house a lot of the refining capacity in terms of graphite, lithium and cobalt, and they're locking up raw materials. So we've seen a big push to secure raw materials at the mine level, so purchasing mines, but also offtake deals with new development companies. Particularly, we've seen that with spodumene production from Australia for lithium spodumene, the hard rock form of lithium. So they're not only locking up the raw materials, they're locking up the supply chain all the way through to the EV, essentially.
Caspar, what should the U.S. do to catch up on the battery supply chain?
Well, there are a number of development projects in the US, cobalt development projects. So they do have cobalt. They just haven't developed the mines. I think the critical steps would be to help. We saw the critical minerals list, but I think maybe put battery raw materials as on a further kind of classification beyond that of some kind of importance where the government assists those companies that are really, working to develop these assets. Of course, then also to alongside the raw material production at the mine to help develop the supply chain through to the cell. So, as you say, refining capacity, and this can be, backed for various different ways by the government with tax incentives or otherwise to develop that supply chain domestically itself, which will help, of course, not only the commodity sector but the technology sector and the auto sector as well.
In the same testimony, Simon Moore also said that he expects lithium demand to increase 9 times, cobalt 6 times, and nickel to increase 5 times in the next decade. Do you foresee this demand to be constricted by the supply of these battery metals? Will there be a steady supply being able to come through in the supply chain?
I think there isn't really an issue with there being enough minerals in the ground, say, for example. I think that's not a problem. I think the problem will be getting those minerals to the battery plants on time. So, if you look at typically to build a battery plant, you're looking at something like 2, maybe 3 years to get that into production. For a mine, probably best case realistically, okay, there are some examples where it's been less, but 7 years. 7 to 10 years from discovery to production. So there's obviously a big time lag difference between the two. And what we have seen at the moment really is big investment in the downstream. So it's going about it the wrong way round. So big investment in the downstream from cell production, but not the same level of investment in raw material production. So we have seen some new production particularly in the lithium industry, but it's there's still a long way to go. The lithium market by the mid-2020s is going to need to be well over 1 million tons from 300,000 today. Cobalt, the same thing. We have seen some increased production from the DRC, but particularly at today's prices, we're not seeing investment in the industry. And the problem will come in the future is not having the minerals. In the long term, the supply chain will sort itself out, but it will be a case of getting them to the battery plants when they need them. And that's when we'll see tightening and, of course, higher prices in the markets.
Okay, I hear you. Caspar, before we wrap up, can you let our listeners know more about the reports produced by Benchmark Minerals and how they can benefit readers?
Yeah, so I kind of briefly mentioned the pricing reports earlier. So we produce monthly price assessments for lithium, cobalt, and graphite. We're looking to add nickel chemical to that later this year. We are the lithium industry's reference price, so our prices are used around negotiations for supply deals. We're looking to get those written into contracts as a formula basis, but we are currently the lithium industry's reference price and hoping for it to be the benchmark price. So if you're interested in this sector and you want to know what's happening with the raw material commodity prices, I really suggest you have a look at our website and maybe there's a form there you can fill out where you can get some more information. If you're looking at a longer term view, we also do long term forecasting for those minerals and nickel as well. So that's supply, demand, and pricing, and bespoke consultancy services we offer as well. So if you are seriously looking at this sector and want to understand more, I'd really suggest you reach out. And then finally, we also have a number of events each year. That information is available on our website, benchmarkminerals.com. I suggest you check it out and get in contact if you want to know more.
Okay, so benchmarkminerals.com. And do you have a Twitter that we can follow you on?
Yes, at Benchmark Min is the company Twitter account. You'll see, there's a number of different analysts who are regularly retweeted on that. So follow us there. But my personal one is at CDM Rawles, Rawles. If you want updates on cobalt and battery megafactories, that's a good place to start.
Great, Caspar. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know?
I guess, I think we've sort of covered most things, but I guess I'd say don't be put off by what's happening in current these commodity prices we talked about. As I say, nothing's linear. The long-term fundamentals of the market haven't changed. We're seeing some really strong interest. We deal a lot with the entire supply chain and nothing's changed. If anything, those numbers in the future are only getting bigger. So it's a good place to be, and watch this space for more growth and a more exciting story to come.
Okay, so we've seen nickel go up about 3,000 USD per ton since the beginning of the year. Any forecast or prediction for cobalt by year's end?
I have to say, my personal opinion on cobalt this year is that we probably haven't got that much further to fall, but I don't think we're going to see a rally like we did in 2017. I think we might see prices go up a little bit towards the end of H2 because typically in the battery industry, the second half of the year is kind of the more busy period. So I think we might see prices rise a bit then, but we've had a lot of supply come online out of the DRC, which will help balance that rising demand. And I think, I'm looking to 2020 for more significant price rises, and, into the early 2020s, the numbers start to get pretty interesting in terms of trying to match that growth in demand. So this year, I think maybe kind of a more stable year than we've seen in recent ones for cobalt. But as I say, the kind of longer term outlook is still extremely strong.
Okay. Caspar Rawles, we thank you for your time, and we hope to have you back on the show. And let's keep an eye out for nickel, cobalt, and lithium this year.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for having me on the show. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Caspar Rawles from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. To find out more about Caspar's work, please visit benchmarkminerals.com. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on new content. And do also check out the SBTV podcast on iTunes and Spotify.